So this is still on the history in the 19th century, where in the US you get really quite early, Massachusetts being the first state which says children have to go to school. Again, this is 8 to 14, so we're getting closer to kind of secondary school. But in the UK, again, it was a little bit, it was the sort of earlier age bracket, 5 to 13. And this is, 1870. And that's where, again, this was done like in the US, where it was states who led the way. In the UK, schools are also supposed to be, and still are, sort of locally run by communities, and they were funded, importantly in the UK, through taxes on property. So the wealthy, not just the wealthy, but certainly the wealthy would pay to educate the children. And why is this? Okay, so partly this is social problems. In this era, we see urbanization. We see lots and lots of people moving to the cities to work in big factories after the Industrial Revolution. And as a result of things like poverty, you see crime, you see youths with not huge amounts to do, who are starving. If you've ever read any Charles Dickens or seen any films based on Charles Dickens, then you would have seen this sort of thing. And so there was an idea that these people need to be educated. They need moral education. They need education that will help them be employed. They need to be educated so that they don't go into crime and things like this. But also, again, religion is important. So religious people, we've got this word non-conformist. It's a very complicated word, but it essentially means certain groups who put a lot of emphasis on community and the individual's moral role within a sort of moral and Christian way of life. Okay, then when do we really get secondary education in the UK? Well, we get it passed during World War II. Okay, and why is that? Well, it's because there's a real concern after the UK and a lot of Europe has been bombed so badly about how are you going to rebuild the country? How are you going to modernize so that Britain can go back to being a wealthy country, even though a lot of the workforce were killed in the war? There was also a recognition that people weren't necessarily being trained in some of the new sort of complex technologies and jobs that were becoming important in the world. Also concerns about inequality, and the idea being that if everyone gets an education, then you will have more equal society, you will have less poverty. And also people are worried about political revolutions and things like that, because obviously after a war where there's lots of misery and poverty, that can often be when political unrest happens. Then in the US, what's really important is segregation. So if you've studied this at all in school, you'll know that African-American children had separate schools in the southern states especially, and they were definitely not as good as the schools for the white children. And then essentially what happens is in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Supreme Court in America say you cannot segregate these schools anymore. African-American children are allowed to go to the same schools as white students. And that is really important, and we're actually going to come back and look at that in later lectures.